Hello, I'm Mark, and this is the Fast Track Impact podcast, where we look at how researchers can become more productive and use their work to achieve real-world impacts. Today I want to think specifically about some of the challenges and benefits of trying to generate impact as part of your PhD. Now, I did a fairly applied PhD myself, so it was quite natural for me to engage with impact as part of my work. But I know from experience that many others find this much more challenging. So I want to take a detailed and critical look at the challenges as well as the benefits of engaging with impact in your PhD. As an interview episode, I want to make room for my guest and don't want to make things too long, so I don't have a tip for you this week. But I want to unpack today's episode a little before we start. I was quite surprised, but I've actually found this a remarkably controversial topic as I've worked on this over the years. Many PhD supervisors really don't like me training students to generate impact from their work because they're worried that impact will just be a distraction from their students' research. Some PhD students have told me that it's not appropriate or even possible because PhDs are by their nature so short-term, so narrowly specialised, and there are so many other demands of students these days. So today I want to focus on some of these challenges and think creatively with you about how you can achieve impact without compromising your PhD. I'm going to do this in conversation with my colleague and fellow Fast Track Impact trainer, Jen Chubb, who I met a few weeks ago in my office in Newcastle University. And I'm very happy to report that she has now successfully passed her PhD viva. So here is my conversation with Dr. Jen Chubb. I am privileged to be sitting here with Jen Chubb. Very welcome to you. I'm working with you in a number of guises. One of the things that interests me most about your work is the work that you do as a researcher on research impact and trying to understand how processes where we evaluate impact, such as the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, actually affect people's motivation and the various other behaviours that you end up getting when you actually evaluate things in those kind of formal ways. So fascinating research, but perhaps for another day. The other way in which I work with you is on Fast Track Impact, of course, and some of the trainings that you do with us. And you particularly work with PhD students in the training that we do. And I'm interested to hear a little bit more about how you yourself engaged with stakeholders with impact in your own PhD and the kind of advice you give to PhD students when you're training on how you can be an engaged PhD student and generate real-world impacts as part of the PhD process. So tell us a bit more about yourself to start with, Jen.
Okay, hi Mark. Hey. So I've kind of got a bit of a hybrid role, as we were saying. So I'm carrying out research at the Department of Education at the University of York, but also consulting for Fast Track Impact. And that's arising from the fact that for the last 10 years I've worked at the universities of Leeds and York in a training capacity, supporting research students and staff in the areas of research and innovation, and as the agenda developed, impact over time. But at the same time, I've been carrying out my research, which has just been submitted recently. I'm having a viva in July, so fingers crossed for that.
Hey, good luck.
Thank you. So my research has been looking very much. It actually arose from my training, I'd say. It's very much looking at some of the issues on the ground affecting researchers when it comes to articulating, performing, and assessing impact, but at all stages of their careers and across all of the disciplines. And I'm specifically looking at some of the more philosophical or political effects on researchers, both in terms of their behaviours and how it affects their kind of identities within those disciplines that we're looking at. And I'd say that in terms of thinking about engaging with impact when you're doing a PhD, mine was almost implicit because it was driven by practice. So I was inspired by something that I was in a training room and and researchers were coming back at me with quite a lot of challenges, saying, well, hang on, how does this work for me if I'm a pure researcher and I'm working on something very niche? How on earth can I talk about a pathway to impact? Issues such as scientific freedom and questions of values were being sort of raised in training sessions, and I was sort of hit, and my background's philosophy, hit with these kind of philosophical dimensions quite early on. So my research was informed by the researchers on the ground telling me there were these issues, but then at the same time I was sort of working alongside a lot of stakeholders in research because I happened to be working in research policy. So I naturally sort of linked up with organisations like the National Centre for Public Engagement, Research Councils UK, HEFGE, who look after the Research Excellence Framework, and talk to them about, well, what are you doing in this space? Because this is not comfortable for academics, this is not comfortable for researchers. So I'd say, I'm in a sort of confessed, not applied researcher, but somebody who has got that problem focus, challenge-led focus, I suppose. And I respect that for some people it might not be easy to build it in, but it was for me built in a little bit from the outset. Because I suppose I wanted to change, not necessarily change policy, but influence the debate around the policies that were being developed in the UK. At the same time, when I was developing my research ideas and my research questions and talking to both academics and these stakeholders, I was actually, again, sort of tangentially invited over to Australia to give some talks and some training over there, who are at the same time developing research impact policies. Obviously, whilst I'm over there, conversations get going. I actually ended up engaging with their Department of Business and Industry and having various conversations with them. They're behind the UK. They don't want the same problems to face researchers that the UK has faced in some ways, and they want to try and develop policies in a finesse fashion. So I've naturally made those links as I've gone along, and I've kept those links. Now, I know that in the blog where we were talking about research impact, there are the challenges that were raised by some of the sort of the Twitter responses are absolutely valid, and I can empathise with them very well about time and about supervisors' impressions of impact. All those types of things are very valid considerations. But at the same time, there are some easy wins that you can start with, such as for example, I've kept in touch with people and just giving them little bits of my literature review or something like that. Whether or not they read them, you can't guarantee a take-up there, but that's something that you can start to say, look, I've got something of interest. I don't have the findings for you right now, but this is something I think you will be interested in. And developing lots of different multiple points of contact within those organisations so that you have those ongoing dialogues going on.
Yeah, it's something that I've done as well. It's a real no-brainer that you want to provide people with benefits early on, and in a PhD project that's challenging. In other projects it is also challenging. You have to wait for a long time until you actually get the data and have the findings. You have something that you can say which is new, but at the same time you are still on the cutting edge once you finish that literature review part of your PhD, and just bringing other people onto that cutting edge can be really valuable and give something back to them. You've alluded to some of the Twitter comments, and I want to go through some of the critiques, some of the challenges that PhD students typically face, whether or not they're applied or pure. It can be easier or harder, can't it? But we'll come to that. Tell me a little bit more about the benefits that you perceive that you've gained from engaging with stakeholders in your PhD and some of the broader benefits for people's research, for their careers that people get when they do engage with impact as part of their PhD programme.
Okay, so I think as somebody who's done a lot of skills development training, I think about impact in terms of obviously the kind of the red tape that we need to sort of almost answer to, but then also the skills that underpin impact. And I think it's the skills that underpin impact as a PhD student, if you can get involved early, that will actually stand you in good stead regardless of whether you end up being somebody who does impacty type things or whether you just are somebody who maybe doesn't even work in academia, actually goes out into industry or does something completely different. I guess what I'm getting at here is you become a better, it's not necessarily a word that I use a lot, but you do become quite good at networking. You build those relationships, you build a rapport, you learn to understand the ways in which other people operate. I would say that it's actually my impact activities, certainly the public engagement side of things that I've done, has actually led to a better academic a building of my academic credentials, as opposed to the other way around. So, for example, I've been able to collaborate with other academics who are far senior to myself in other areas because they've seen that particular pieces of my research are maybe timely or relevant. I have empirical data and they maybe have the theory, but together we can bring together something quite powerful academically and from the impact aspect. So I think it's building my collaborations academically and outside. It's building networking skills, as I say, and it builds an empathy that will help you in a longer term to develop those relationships, which should hopefully be sustainable longer term, regardless of whether there's a benefit or not, in terms of financial gain or whatever. You want something that's actually just a relationship that develops. So I think those things are very important. I think other benefits are, of course, that you applying for postdocs, they're all asking for impact now. You go to an academic job interview, they will ask you about impact. They will ask you about collaboration. These are things that develop off the back of impact. And so, I was, asked very recently, talk to me about your public engagement profile, talk to me about your altmetrics score. These are things that are now part of the parlance of being in academia, and we have to get on board with it.
Yeah, it's challenging, but equally a real opportunity, I think. And it's funny, a lot of people talk about impact as something that distracts you from your PhD and that will therefore detract from it. And I've had the same experience, and very often for me, it's actually the questions that I get when I go outside the ivory tower. I get asked questions that are of a very different nature to the questions that my academic colleagues might ask me. And they require me to think deeper and broader and very often across disciplinary silos. And as a result of that, I'm actually able to position the work that I do and the papers that then arise from that PhD work in a much broader context that actually has greater impact and greater readership and more citations as a result of having gone through that process. And certainly I know a number of people who have actually ended up going down career paths after their PhD on the basis of the engagement that they did. They came in thinking, I'm going to be an academic. And actually, as they engage with policy or third sector or business or whatever, as part of their PhD process, they began to actually see people in roles that they thought, I could do that. In fact, I would be really good at that. And I would love to do that. And they found out about job opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have had. And amazingly, you end up going down a very different route as a result. In terms of the critiques, a couple of things around timing that have come out of the blog the two of us wrote for the Fast Track Impact blog on how you can fast track impact into your PhD. I think our emphasis, as always with Fast Track Impact, is about doing things time efficiently, and that is, of course, one of the biggest critiques. So people saying, well, if you look at the average impact, certainly as was submitted to our research excellence framework, you're looking 10, 15 years or more, and you've got 3 years, maybe a bit more if you're lucky in a PhD. But also the amount of time it takes. So I've got a couple of quotes here, one from Claire Utman, reinvent the wheel, cure the common cold, anything else they expect us to do in our temporary contract while we're at it. Hannah Carver, you also need to finish your PhD, perhaps work part-time, as well as have a social life. It's a real problem. How do you fit impact generation into a PhD without it detracting or distracting?
Yeah. So, I think, as I say, I'm really sympathetic to this because I think that my message always would be to PhD students, and in terms of myself, and then in terms of the teaching I've done over the last 10 years, has been don't leave this room and say to your supervisor, I've got to spend all my time doing impact now, and Jen says that's what I've got to do, because they will kill me. Because really, your focus is your thesis. It absolutely is. It's not about getting them to do everything, reinvent the wheel, as you say, cure the common cold. But I always suggest it's that, dip your toe in the water of impact, start to have those conversations, build the dialogue, some easy wins around public engagement, right in the conversation, just get into the habit of it.
The conversation being the web-based magazine, news-based magazine that is edited by academics. I believe it gets picked up by a lot of mainstream media outlets.
Yeah, and it's got a lot of integrity. They work with you, so you can take away that fear of working with the media that they're going to exploit it. They won't press go until you're absolutely happy with it. Things like that. Whilst at the same time, I think we have to say, no, this, your thesis should come first, but just try and identify some easy wins. My PhD has been done part-time while I've been working, and I'd say trying to have a social life as well. You can't do everything. Some research will lend itself better to this. So as I said at the beginning, that's the caveat. I'm self-confessed somebody who is inspired by, policy, wanting to influence policy, wanting to influence debate. That's the nature of what I'm doing. I wholeheartily, I'll speak to my friends in music, or I'll speak to my friends in philosophy who are looking at more theoretical aspects, and that doesn't drive them. That isn't their main motivation. For them, perhaps this will be that much more of a challenge. But again, I still think that some of the broad things I've been saying about some of these early wins and kind of easy wins are fulfilling and are achievable. And I think. But again, the supervisor is important here because, as with my research, and as is well understood, impact is not across the board, loved. It's a bit of a Marmite thing, isn't it? And you get a supervisor who's on board with you and thinks, absolutely, you go to that conference that IBM are going to be at. I'm really interested in you engaging with the industry. Then you're okay, you're on track. You get somebody who says, absolutely not. You're selling out. This is it's a low esteem activity. You get somebody who has those opinions, which are valid within, the certain context. Then, you're going to be blocked from doing that. So I think it's really important to recognise what those blockers are within your personal circumstances, rather than seeing a generic kind of, there's no time for this. What is important to do as well, and just the final point, is when you're planning, when you're planning your PhD over those 3 or 6 years, or however long it's going to be, if you're doing it part-time, whatever, is to build in impact, in your Gantt chart, to be very specific about it, the timeline and the milestones that you have written down in terms of your literature review, development, whatever. Even just, I'm going to send an email to the Australian government. I'm going to send that, that could be it, or I'm going to write that conversation article, or I'm going to go down the corridor perhaps, and talk to another another researcher in a different discipline because I can't achieve impact, but they might be able to through working with me. That could be your impact pathway, and that's okay too. So I think there's something around just thinking it through. What does it look like to me? And then building it in a reasonable way, whilst acknowledging that is not necessarily a primary focus. And for some academics, it never will be.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Fast Track Impact Planning template that we use in our trainings, which is available for free on our website as an editable template, is one way in which you can start to think that bit more structured about this kind of thing. And for me, as a PhD student, especially if you can do this at the beginning, as you're saying, although I think it's never too late, it is really valuable to actually think, well, in an ideal world, what are the things that could change that I would love to see people learn about or be inspired by or change? And to then paint out what would be the activities that I would need to do with each of those groups to achieve those kinds of changes, those kinds of benefits. What are the resources I would need? How long might it take? How realistic is this? What are the risks, etc.? And what you can then do is you can work out, well, actually, okay, in an ideal world, that would be amazing. I don't have time. I don't have resources to do X, Y, and Z. But hey, here's one that's a quick one. Here's something that I could do. And I could do that myself. And I could do that quite easily. Great. Those other ones, like you say, who are the people down the corridor? Other PhD students within my cohort who have skills that I might be able to draw on, other academics, other people that I know in my network who could actually help me to achieve this, where they have very similar goals, similar objectives. They want to achieve something similar to me. And actually, when you start thinking systematically about which of those ones you can't do yourself, but who could help you to achieve those, very often things come to you that make it actually possible. And you're not alone. You can work as a team with your supervisors, with others in your disciplinary network, with other PhD students, and you can do swaps. So, hey, I'm a native English speaker. For many of my colleagues, just being able to give feedback on a policy brief, for example, as a native English speaker is hugely valuable. And if one of my colleagues happens to be an amazing photographer and I want an amazing picture on the front, then hey, great, here we go. Or maybe this is actually a joint policy brief we're writing together, and in that way we're beginning to pool expertise, because this is one of the other things people complain about and say, well, I can't do this. I'm working on such a narrow thing. As a PhD student, you typically work on one narrow issue, and you ask yourself, well, how could that be relevant to anyone else? Who else would be interested in that? And if the answer is genuinely, actually, just me and my supervisors and my mum, then ask yourself, well, who could I work with to broaden this out to something that would be genuinely interesting and more relevant to other people?
Well, that's something actually, because as I say, my background's in philosophy, and a lot of, I mean, the arts. I don't want to generalise about the disciplines because it's far more nuanced than that. But in the arts and humanities, there is a sort of tendency to be to find it difficult to think about how some theoretical or more abstract ideas might have some resonance in terms of societal relevance or economic relevance, certainly. But if you think about, I can think of an example in philosophy. Philosophers working on issues of identity. Perhaps thinking, well, how does this, sort of connect? And then working with biologists who are interested in genetics. Coming together, having some really interesting ideas, which might actually have some policy resonance later down the line. And if it's only through those conversations that they'll work out where those ideas and where those kind of issues kind of can be combined for those benefits to be realised. So I think that, I think it's about having those conversations. I think it's equally, though, moving away from impact as a term in and of itself, and maybe just emphasising a little bit more around engagement, as you've just described, Mark, because really, a lot of the issues, a lot of the problems arise when people get too bogged down with thinking they have to change something and they have to affect something within a distinct time period. And I think in a PhD, if PhD students are associating impact and are saying, right, you think about impact as having to be within 3 years, and I'm not surprised they're concerned. But if they're interpreting it as we think you need to start thinking about engagement, that maybe later on down the line may start to have an effect, then I think that shifts the nuance quite significantly, actually. And so we should be encouraging them to, emphasise the activities, as you say, the benefits that they can bring, whilst acknowledging that those changes might not come for some time. So there's quite a lot of distinctions at play here. Ref is one thing, going for a grant is another thing, engagement is another thing. And I think for PhD students, really, we should emphasise the engagement aspect and thinking through those kind of activities. It might even just be a 3-minute thesis competition, which develops their skills in communicating their research to a lay audience, to a number of school kids or, members of the public who have no prior knowledge of their area. Something like that can then really springboard them into being somebody who's good at science communication. And then, then it comes from there. So for me, it's all a matter of, just thinking through what those kind of steps look like, as opposed to this end goal that everyone gets so preoccupied with, which, is problematic.
Yeah, I agree. I think, well, certainly when you and I are training with PhD students, we'll rarely even mention the Research Excellence Framework or RAF, because it's not really a driver at that stage in your career. But I think that very often we put these very instrumental definitions on impact. And if you define impact as you have to have seen a change, a new policy, and that policy implemented, or whatever it is, a new product, a new organisation that is now tackling a problem that you've identified in your research, it is unlikely in the context of a PhD. But there are other types of impact, and I think that although there may be some kind of implicit hierarchy in exercises like RAF, where things which are more instrumental might be valued more highly, perhaps than they ought, there are types of impact based around, for example, awareness building. And the fact that you have a group of people now who are aware that there is a problem with their product, with their policy. You don't have the solution, they don't have the solution, but the fact that they know that there is going to be some unintended consequence, that has value in its own right and is important and is worth doing. more latent, perhaps hidden impacts, where you have now a network of people who know each other, who have shared skills with each other, and who now the next time disaster strikes will be able to pull together and actually adapt and cope with that disaster as a result of the networks, the connectivity, the skills that you have built through your PhD. Things like that are equally valid conceptually as impact, whether or not we might talk about them to the outside world. And I think we need to value that. And I think that these things are achievable within the context of a PhD. And when you do achieve them, the kind of the side effect of that is you get all these great skills in communication and confidence and public speaking, all this kind of stuff that actually are transferable into pretty much any career.
I say one more thing. I think about I think a preoccupation that thought that impact has to come from face to face, which might be nice, but of course we've got now the social media platforms that would make a lot of this stuff so much more easy. A lot of the sort of impact activities that I'm talking about actually come from you just sitting in the library just banging off an email. That takes no time. Obviously you can think it through before you write it. But things like Twitter, things that, like I was talking about altmetrics and, all these types of ways in which you can start to engage or get your name known. These are easy wins. The Parliament website, which has, an email list that you can just literally type in your area of expertise and it will send you an email every week, and it'll say what inquiries are going on, if there's any select committees going on, if there's any government consultations that are in your area. You can then choose to respond if you want to. Those are the types of things I would suggest. Just start to know what's going on in your area, and and that might not always be appropriate for some areas, but as you say, and there may be more nuanced ways in which you develop impact, and that might just come from simply working across and within disciplines to achieve that greater longer term goals. But I think if you don't start to have those conversations and have that willingness, then of course it does affect the quality of what you're doing, and in terms of moving on to have an academic career, it can really, maybe it's not unfortunate, I think we are at a place now where that is part of the academic contract, and it's something we need to be able to at least have an awareness of and have some experience of, and so I think it's a multifaceted thing which is problematic, and my research is living proof of that. But I think it's something that if we just take some time to reflect on what is meaningful to us, as you say, what kind of impact domain does make sense within my research. How do I go about maximising the opportunity for those individuals or groups to benefit from my work? Understanding they may not care, they may block it, they may love it, or they may completely reject it for other reasons. But if you've made the attempt to allow them the opportunity to benefit from it, then that's really all we can do in this context, and that then, as you say, develops those underpinning skills which could be useful in any walk of life.
Yeah, I guess for me, I think the take-home message for me is it's worth giving it a try. You just got to dipping your toe in the water, seeing how this goes. You don't have to have a grand plan. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, no one's going to hit you over the head if you don't achieve everything that you set out to achieve. But work out what would motivate you, what you would really feel is meaningful, is valuable, and what you might be able to do. And you may well be surprised at how far you get, and how motivational it is when you see those things happen. You see that kid that you worked with, their eyes light up, that moment where they just suddenly understood something and they were inspired by what you were doing in that public engagement event. I think that for me, as a PhD student, I think, as with many people, it was incredibly hard to motivate myself at times. I think every PhD student, certainly that I've met and supervised, goes through these peaks and troughs, and it can be really hard to pick yourself up when it feels like things are going wrong, etc. So I think if we can engage with impact, it can be a really nice kind of release valve in terms of just getting away from your research for a moment, doing something different, and sometimes you get rewards on a much shorter timescale than you otherwise would have.
I'll say one more thing as well, is I think it's a very likely valid Viva question as well. You know, what's the relevance of your research? So even if you just think about it in the terms of, I've got to, I want to get through this Viva, it would not be out of the question. They want to know you've done an original piece of work. What's the relevance of it? You know, who's going to be affected by this work? Or they may have ideas about the impact partners that you've never even thought of before. They might suggest it in the Viva. Have you thought about this? So I think even just reflecting on it from the perspective of, I want to pass my Viva.
Yeah. Well, it has to be said, I've done a number of Vivas in my time, and every single one of them I have asked that question. That's my last question. Yeah. I'm not sure if every external examiner does that, but I certainly do. Yeah. We're going to leave it there, Jen. Thank you very much. So I really enjoyed my chat with Jen, and I hope that whether or not you are a PhD student, you've taken inspiration and ideas from this interview. Doing a PhD is hard, and generating impact is not mandatory for any of us, let alone if you are a PhD student. So if you feel like some of the people who reacted to my blog with Jen, and this just feels like too much, then don't let me or Jen or anyone else put pressure on you to take on more than you want to do. I hope, however, that for some of you at least, you can see ways in which you can make your PhD more relevant to others and make more of a difference in ways that won't take you too long or distract from your research. And I hope that if you do try out some of the ideas that Jen and I discussed, you'll find new inspiration and become reinvigorated to pursue your research and start opening new doors for after your PhD that you might not have even known existed. For today's action, I'm going to be a bit selfish, so I hope you will bear with me. But today is the last episode in my second series. I have massively enjoyed recording these episodes each week and sharing these ideas with you. So I hope if you've enjoyed this as well, then you might do me a wee favour. One thing I'd love you to do this week is to share this podcast with someone else that you think might enjoy this. You can simply rate the podcast on iTunes as a simple way of making it more likely that others will find it. The more strong ratings that the show gets, the more people iTunes will automatically suggest it to. Alternatively, consider putting a link to the show on social media or email it to a colleague. It's fasttrackimpact.com/podcast. Whatever you decide to do with what you've learned today and from this series, do it with passion, do it with conviction, and I cannot wait to hear the stories of the impacts that you achieve before I'm back with another series next year.